Check the mic and make sure it sound right, boys. Sound right, boys. Sound right, boys. It sound right, boy.
Hi, everyone. So we have made it to almost the end of our 19th The Ed Collab gathering. It's hard to believe that we've had 19 of these across the years. Every Ed Collab gathering has always been free, always been no registration. And our goal is both to share incredible learning by educators for educators with as easy access as possible to all of you, and to raise money for charities adopted by our keynotes. I've already heard from several of you today that being able to watch from your couch on your TV has been a really nice addition. I also, at times when I was done here, went over to my couch there and was watching many of the incredible sessions today in the comfort of my living room. So thank you for that feedback. We're happy that we can have yet another way to share this incredible day with you. So before I introduce our terrific keynote to end the day, just a few thanks and announcements. So first of all, a huge thank you to everyone who made today possible. All of the presenters, the sessions are just stunning and incredible. We are always inspired and amazed by the hard, dedicated work that folks choose to share with us, and today was no exception. I caught several sessions across the day. I didn't catch all of them, but the good news is you didn't miss anything, because all of the sessions for the entire gathering, like all of our gatherings, are available on our YouTube page. So if you go to that same playlist that we've been sharing with you all day, you can find all of the sessions there. Also, our gathering website will stay live until our next gathering that happens in September. So if you found it easier to navigate, or if you wanted to read more of presenters' bios and you wanted to connect with them, you can go back to the gathering page, and all of that will stay archived there until our next gathering in September. Thank you also to our tech team and our media support today, everyone that helped to tweet, watch, share, and make sure that everything was up and running. A extra special thank you to Jessica Walsh, who's on the Zoom with us right now, making sure that this runs. Jessica has been a co-leader and now leader of the tech team since we started. So all 19 of these, Jessica has been a part of as well. And Jessica, I know you can hear me. This wouldn't happen without your support. Thank you so much for your dedication, your professionalism, in addition to your busy job as an educator and your life outside of all of this. Truly, your work, your vision, your heart is so special, and we're so, so grateful for it. So thank you. Please join me in thanking Jessica. There's her Twitter handle. You can thank her online as well, too. So an announcement. We're turning 20. Wow, we're so young and youthful. We're turning 20. It's our 10th year as an organization, and we hold this conference twice every year since the very beginning. So fall 2023 is our 20th The Ed Collab gathering. Wow, so it's near drinking age. So we invite you to celebrate with us. We hope that you'll come be a part of the gathering. We'd like to make it as extra special, as big, and perhaps out of the box as it's ever been before. So get ready. Here's a few things for you to record. Number one, the date. So our gathering is happening on Saturday, September 23rd. Every gathering happens every September and April on a Saturday. So Saturday, September 23rd is when you will get to see us here on the gathering. Our keynote speaker is Roald III. Roald III is an incredible author and illustrator of many, many books for children and young readers. We're so excited to have him, his energy, his passion, and his vision for young readers. He will be keynoting the gathering, and then we hope that that day includes you too. So session proposals are open right now. They are live. If you're on the gathering page, you just go up to where it says proposals. You can click that and boop, let us know what session you'd like to share. We love sessions that are co-led by more than one leader. We love panels. We especially love sessions with students. So anything that you'd like to share with the world, please, please let us know. So we look forward to that. Our 20th, the gathering. I can't believe that we're already up to that number. We're looking forward to it, and we hope that you'll join us too. And thank you to Raul, who'll be joining us for the day. So it is truly my pleasure to introduce our closing keynote for our spring 2023 gathering, Shawna Coppola. Shawna is an educator. She is an activist. She is an author for teachers. She's a dear, dear colleague and friend. We text each other about world stuff, and we text each other when we both are like, what is happening? And I'm just so grateful, Shawna, for you and for your friendship and for being a colleague. Thank you. Right back at you. Shawna, you can find her very long bio, her illustrious bio on our website. You also can find her at her own website, shawnacoppola.com. You can follow her on Twitter, Shawna Coppola, and on Instagram, Shawna_Coppola. Shawna is the author of terrific books for educators, which really takes what you know and love and think you believe about instruction, about writing and coming soon, about how we think about literacy instruction in general. And she constantly, I know for me, challenges us to rethink and outthink the practices we already know, always trying to get as close as possible to children, to their engagement, to their voice, and to really supporting them and growing. Her books, Writing Redefined and Renew, Becoming a Better and More Authentic Writing Teacher, are must-haves for your writing instruction. And she has a new title coming out, Literacy for All, a framework for anti-oppressive teaching. Pre-orders are available now, and you can find that on the underneath her bio. There's a link to it. I got to read an advanced copy. Thank you for that, Shawna. And it is truly, truly fantastic, thoughtful. I think one of my big takeaways from the advanced pages was just how Shawna not only helps you really uncover and dig into your own practice and the practices that you know, but also to continually question and mine even deeper. I feel like every time in that book, I got to a point where I was like, oh, okay, oh, I see what you're saying. Then there was a whole nother question to ask too. And I just found that work so valuable. As you know, our day is totally free, no registration. So we ask when you're inspired to please pay the joy forward. You can donate to any charity or you can donate to any charity or give your time in any way that you'd like. It doesn't just have to be monetarily, but we do ask our keynotes to adopt some charities for us. And so Shawna has chosen the Transgender Law Center, whose website was down this morning, but we hear it's back up again. Shawna says, I would love to choose the Transgender Law Center. Not only is it the largest national trans-led organization advocating self-determination for all people, but I deeply appreciate how they center trans and gender nonconforming migrants and Black trans women in their work. So if at any point in this afternoon's keynote, if you're inspired, which I know you will be, please do go over to our charity link. You can find it on our website, and please consider giving to the Transgender Law Center. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome as our closing keynote today, Shawna Coppola.
Thank you so much, dear friend.
I'm so happy you're here.
Yeah. I hope folks can hear me okay. And hello, everybody. Thank you for joining me for the closing session of the Ed Collab gathering. I know how important it is to conserve your time and energy as educators and as human beings, and particularly in the current climate. And so I'm that much more appreciative that you have chosen to take the time to watch and or listen, whether you're doing so live right now or via the recording. Before I begin, I just want to say that I myself have had the joy of watching several of the sessions today. And, you know, every time I think about the amount of work that goes, volunteer work, that goes into the sessions and the technology support and, like Chris said, the media support, it just makes me get all up in my feels. So I just also want to echo what Chris said and thank everybody, particularly the tech team, for all the work that you've done. And I will get right started. So just bear with me as I attempt to share the portion of my screen that I want to share. So let's see. There, that should work. Okay, so today I am going to talk about how crucial it is for us as educators to develop an anti-oppressive praxis. And I hope to offer at least one doorway into this work through an essential paradigm shift that we can make in regard to not just how we conceive literacy, but how we conceive literacy education. So that's my goal today. But first, I think it's absolutely important to acknowledge my positionality, which includes the fact that I am coming to you today from the unceded ancestral homelands of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples. And that includes peoples past and present. So it's here in the community where I live that the raid on Oyster River occurred in 1694, which was in response to the British settlers who were here and the leaders breaking promises outlined in the Treaty of Pemaquid. So I acknowledge and I honor with gratitude those people, that land, and the waterways, the living beings, and all of the people who have stewarded and who continue to steward Ndakina for many millennia. Now, it's also important that I acknowledge my identity. So as a cis white woman who grew up attending public school in the United States, I both identified as a reader and writer early on in my life, and I was identified as a reader and writer by the adults in my life, and in particular, my teachers. And a huge reason for both of these things as I look back on it and really reflect on that time is due to the fact that my school and classroom spaces both centered and privileged my home and community language and literacy practices. And this was not visible to me at the time because these practices were and are still considered the norm or standard way of speaking and engaging with text. And I had not yet learned to question this. Just as one example that you can kind of see here, I'm curious to know if anybody recognizes the workbook. That is a workbook that I was in elementary school. But one of the examples that I wanted to share is how my classmates and I were taught to use the English language, which, as you know, hopefully if you can see this example in this case and what it says, and this comes directly from the workbook, this particular exercise actually completely dismisses the ways in which many African-American families and communities use language, particularly outside of school spaces and home spaces and community spaces. And the grammatical features of what Dr. April Baker Bell calls Black language would theoretically be marked incorrect here. If we were to, it says at the very top using words correctly. And that's just one of so many examples. But in addition to this, the texts that were privileged throughout my K-12 experience largely centered characters with whom I could relate. And this is when I was developing formative beliefs about what the world was like and what it should be or shouldn't be. And it wasn't actually until I took an elective my senior year in high school, which unfortunately was called minority literature, that I had any prolonged exposure to stories that didn't feature white characters and their experiences navigating the world. And I certainly didn't have any experience with texts that involved any translanguaging practices at all. So as a literacy educator, and it's been almost a quarter century now, which is wild to me, but I spent the first decade, at least, of my career perpetuating many of these same ideas through the language and literacy practices that I centered and privileged in my own classroom. One example that I like to use for this, just to illustrate this, involves how I, as a child and as a teenager, was taught to compose stories, and how I then, in return, taught students to compose stories. And that was using a classic, quote unquote, story structure. That's kind of how people reference it. It's like this classic structure. You might know a version of it as Freytag's pyramid, which you can see on the left. Now, this structure feels ubiquitous to those of us whose home literacy practices and texts include such a storytelling structure. But as many of you are well aware, this is only one of many, many story structures throughout the world, used throughout the world. And solely teaching this structure without teaching any other structure really dismisses the traditional story structures of, for example, many First Nations cultures, many South Asian communities, West African cultures, and so on. But the Euro-centered pyramid structure is often still the only story structure that students are formally taught in school literacy spaces. And that tells a clear and distinct story of which literacy practices are most valued. Now, I feel like if you're listening today, if you're here, especially if you're watching live and took the time out of your Saturday to watch live, you might not be asking this question, but certainly you know of colleagues who might ask, why is it important for us to develop an anti-oppressive praxis as an educator? Because often we hear folks say things like, teaching should be apolitical, or it's not our job to indoctrinate children. But the truth of the matter is, as you and I know, is that teaching and being in the world is inherently political. Our politics, our ideologies are very much tied to our identities, and our language and literacy practices cannot be decontextualized from this, as much as some may wish it to be. It's just impossible. And I was looking at, we all, I think, probably know some of the statistics around our profession, but I was looking at them in light of this idea of how our identities are so intricately tied to our language and literacy practices. And so I just want to share some statistics from the National Center for Education Statistics. And so I'm just going to read these to you. So one of the statistics, the first one says that 79% of public school teachers in the US are white and non-Hispanic. 78% of school principals in the US are white and non-Hispanic. And 65.3% of school superintendents are white and non-Hispanic. And yet, 46% of all public elementary and secondary school students in the US are white and non-Hispanic. So it stands when we look at sort of the ways in which the demographics, especially when we look specifically around race and ethnicity, and how various ethnicities are racialized in different ways, it stands to reason that if the vast majority of educators in the US and the vast majority of school leaders in the US are white and non-Hispanic, that they're going to be centering, they're going to continue to perpetuate that centering of the literacy practices of that dominant racial group. But the big issue, and that's an issue in itself, but an even bigger issue is that this is often done so under the guise of labeling these practices as, quote, standard or academic. Now, I have intentionally focused on race and sharing these statistics because racial advantage and oppression, or more specifically, who is and who is not granted the protection of whiteness in our society, is connected to all other forms of oppression. And this typically happens in ways that are often made invisible. So when we think about things like gender oppression or religious oppression or linguistic oppression, we need to understand and acknowledge that all of these are tied to white supremacy, and they're tied to the desire to maintain white power. So explaining how that all connects is far beyond the scope of this talk today, but if you are interested in diving deeper into that topic, I would definitely recommend spending time, lots and lots of time, with the work of folks like Alice Wong and Angela Davis and Bell Hooks and Sabrina Strings and so many of the folks that I'm going to cite and reference today. So in order to really dig in at how crucial it truly is for us to develop an anti-oppressive practice as literacy educators, we need to consistently be asking questions, and in particular, these two questions. One is, whose literacy and language practices are most valued and as a result, most often centered in school spaces? And second, how do my identities affect the biases and assumptions that I might hold around language and literacy? So I just want to have us sit with that for just a moment. And I just want to say that, I'm the first to admit that I haven't always asked this question myself. Again, frankly, as someone whose language and literacy practices were and are still considered the norm, particularly in school spaces, it never occurred to me to do so before I entered my 30s. So I want to acknowledge just a few of the scholars whose giant metaphorical shoulders that I stand on and whose work you can find in the link to my handout on the Ed Collab Gathering page. So these scholars include many more people than are pictured here, but I want to acknowledge they include Drs. David Kirkland, Dr. April Baker Bell, H. Richard Milner, Ann Haas Dyson, Marcel Haddix, Chris Gutierrez, and so many more, particularly folks who are colleagues of mine in the Educator Collaborative as well. So going back just quickly, keeping these two big questions in the back of our heads, let's also look at some of the ways that people both within and outside of education talk about literacy. So I'm going to ask you to think about if you've heard any of the following statements or said them yourself. And just for accessibility purposes, I'm going to read these aloud, especially if you might be walking and listening like I was this morning. So one statement is, literacy is the civil rights issue of our time. Another one says, literacy is the key to interrupting the school to prison pipeline. And the third is, if only our students could read. Let's take a moment or so to reflect on these statements and where we've heard them, who has said them, whether we have said them or believed them before. And I want to also push back on these statements, most of which I at one time have expressed in one way or another. And I'm anticipating the discomfort, which is why I'm sort of like being super awkward here right now. But one of the things that I found most fascinating in my research, and much of this is thanks to scholars like Amy J. Wan, is how often literacy is used as a proxy for education in general, and also as a proxy for full citizenship and all of the assumed rights and privileges that come with it. And this has been the case throughout our nation's history. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with Dr. Wan's work, but through her work, she illustrates just really beautifully how the historical use of print literacy, in particular, English print literacy, and specifically print literacy tests, have been used to confer or deny both citizenship status and the benefits of citizenship, such as voting in the United States. She also makes visible the inherent assumptions embedded in all of that, which include the belief that citizenship and and all of the assumed rights and privileges that come with it is an achievable status by those who have the will for it, rather than it being tied to the power of folks around us, particularly folks protected by whiteness. And she also makes visible the assumption that equality and even liberation is synonymous with and can be achieved through citizenship. And because it's tied to education and literacy, through those things as well. And yes, although certainly in many, many contexts, literacy can be liberatory, part of nurturing an anti-oppressive praxis is to also acknowledge, and I think this is really difficult, but really important to acknowledge, how literacy can and has been used as a tool of oppression and a tool for oppression. And this is just one of 5 principles that I've identified within the framework that I've created for my next book to help us develop this anti-oppressive praxis. And so some of the others here, you can see literacy involves both cognitive practices or processes and social practices. Identity and literacy are inextricably linked. All human beings engage in literacy and language practices that are both valid and valuable. Meaning making occurs within a variety of equally valid communicative channels or modes. And then this one, which is actually my favorite part of the book to write, because it really, I was able to just really bring in so much history, and it just helped me articulate sort of this idea that has been part of my own work for so many years. And that, of course, is that literacy can be used as a tool for liberation as well as a tool for oppression, depending on who's using it and in what context. So let's first reflect on some of the ways that literacy, and again, specifically English print literacy, has been used as an oppressive tool, largely by white folks in power throughout our nation's history. So many of us are aware, for example, that the English print literacy education of Black folks for much of our nation's history was either strictly controlled, or in the case of those who were enslaved at the time, outright prohibited through anti-literacy laws. And you can see a couple of texts where this is referenced here in this slide. I'll give you a moment to kind of take a look at them. So the first one is from the Liberator, 1839 in Louisiana. The penalty for instructing a free Black is for the first offense, $500, for the second offense, death. And the second shows an excerpt from a brief historical sketch of Negro education in Georgia by Richard R. Wright. This is from 1894, and it says, it references school and education and literacy, and the possession of this literacy is what made the white man so independent and so powerful. So literacy tied to power, tied to rights, tied to citizenship, tied to who gets to be conceived of as a full human. One of the scholars whose work I really, really appreciate and was really excited to dig into when I was writing this book is that of Heather Andrea Williams. And she's an African-American studies scholar. And she writes in her book, Self-Taught, that the presence of English print literate slaves threatened to give lie to the entire system of chattel slavery. And she's not the first person to talk about this or to write about this, but I really appreciated how she kind of brought it all together. She says, reading indicated to the world that this so-called property had a mind, and writing foretold the ability to construct an alternative narrative about bondage itself. Literacy among slaves would expose slavery, and masters knew it. Now, some enslaved Black folks in states where these anti-literacy laws were passed were permitted to engage in what was called Bible literacy. But this was only the case once baptism was removed as an avenue toward freedom in the middle of the 17th century. So these laws and practices serve as a classic case of literacy being used as a tool of oppression. However, as we know, many enslaved folks learned to read and write English through their collective determination, as well as through the subversive assistance of others, which helped them communicate more effectively with one another, since their kidnappers deliberately would separate them from those who shared their linguistic history and their linguistic practices. They were deliberately cut off from folks who shared those practices and language practices. And so this work of collective determination, of creating spaces and opportunities for them to learn English print literacy is, of course, an example of using literacy as a tool for liberation. So again, depending on the context and who is involved, literacy can either be used as a tool for oppression or for liberation. Now, many of us are familiar with the use of literacy tests. And on the left, you see an example of a literacy test from the state of Louisiana. And the use of literacy tests to restrict access to US citizenship and the rights that accompany citizenship is yet another example of white folks in power using literacy as a tool for oppression. So for example, the Immigration Commission, which was appointed by the House of Representatives in 1906, unanimously recommended the restriction of immigration, and with a single dissenting voice, just one single dissenter, agreed that the best form of restriction was a literacy test, and that such a test would be, quote, one way to keep out the ignorant, the vicious, and the lazy. A particular person who was part of this commission, Oscar W. Underwood of Alabama, he even went so far to argue that such a restriction using literacy tests would help, quote, maintain the purity of the French, German, and English-speaking races. And of course, literacy tests have also been used for the disenfranchisement of Black men at the polls over the course of our history. Now, less visible, let me just make sure you can see all of this. So less visible and perhaps more uncomfortable for some of us to think about is how literacy has been used as a tool of oppression through the dominant narrative around our country's literacy crisis, which has been in play in the US since the 1830s and possibly even earlier. Now with this, what happens with this dominant narrative is that often it's accompanied by a call for literacy educators to return, quote, back to basics. And I'm gonna show you some current headlines around that in a couple of slides. We can see that this happens with every wave of literacy crisis narratives and every wave of legislation related to literacy in our country's history. And this back to basics idea, or this call for back to basics, is often mandated through legislation or through policies. So if it's not mandated through state legislation, it's mandated through district or school policy. But as many researchers have noted, these waves of discourse and the policies that have accompanied them have done virtually nothing to narrow the so-called achievement gap, because it's not an achievement gap. It's actually not the crisis that we should be concerned about. But why do we think this is? What is with all of these waves of literacy crisis narratives and these pushes to mandate and legislate, why do we still see a gap in those whose language and literacy practices are centered in schools and between those folks and those whose are not? What is this all about? Well, as one of my favorite scholars, Ann Haas-Dyson, says, instruction focused on the basics is most visible in schools serving low-income children and are themselves undergirded by a hierarchical and homogeneous view of language, what language is, what language should sound like, what it should look like. Furthermore, while the explicit teaching of so-called basic skills, such as those necessary for, say, orthographic mapping, these can be liberatory. This explicit teaching, it can be liberatory, but it's only liberatory, again, in certain contexts. Because when the basics are decontextualized from children's cultural identities and lived experiences, and their literacy and language practices, these basics or this basics education can actually serve as yet another way to oppress those whose literacy and language practices do not match those held up as the standard. So I promised you I would show you these headlines. These are just some of the headlines that I have grabbed from, I think, it's at least from the past few weeks. I don't think there's one that's any later than that. So this is just in the past few weeks, some of the headlines online that have been calling for back to basics. I'll give you a moment to kind of look at those. So as with many waves, going back to the dominant US literacy crisis narrative, as with many waves, this current wave and the same call for back to basics policy and legislation without any discussion among those in power around how this might play out for historically underserved populations. We're seeing this today through its current proxy. Now, don't get mad or get mad, it's okay. But through the dominant narrative around the so-called science of reading, this is happening again. This is happening without enough conversation, like I said, around or discussion around how some of these mandates and policies that are being enacted are going to play out for historically underserved populations. And this is yet another example of how literacy can be used as a tool for oppression. And of course, even more visibly and more, just frighteningly, we're experiencing an unprecedented rise in book challenges that are designed to oppress those whose identities and lived experiences do not fit those of the dominant norm. So the texts that are being challenged the most, of course, are those that serve as liberatory counter narratives to dominant narratives designed to uphold white hegemony and heteronormativity. And this has been the case throughout the world's history. When we look at book bans and book challenges across our history, this has always been the case. The vast majority of them have been used to oppress those whose identities and lived experiences do not fit the dominant norm or the dominant ideologies around what's right, around what's acceptable or appropriate. So again, can literacy be used as a tool of liberation? Yes, of course. We've seen this happen in a multitude of contexts, some of which I've already mentioned. but particularly contexts that intentionally decenter whiteness and decenter white middle-class Euro-American ideologies around what quote unquote counts as literacy. So, these are just a couple of initiatives, but initiatives like the Comic Book Project, which is a New York City program, for those of you who are unfamiliar with it, that's focused on specifically supporting the literacy skills of urban youth, is one such example. And Somos Escritores, which my colleague and friend, Dr. Tracy Flores, has co-founded or founded herself. This was really created specifically to help Latina girls develop their voices through writing. So projects like this, they are examples of how this can be done. But what I'm noticing is, by and large, many of these projects are limited to spaces that are outside of school or are supplemental to what happens in school spaces. But we also see literacy being used as a tool of liberation through Black literacy societies over the course of our nation's history, through the counter narratives that people have been brave enough to create in different spaces. And I'm not just talking about the counter narratives that we see in traditional publishing, but those that we see on social media has been enormously important for this tool of using literacy as a tool for liberation. We see it in language reclamation efforts. So again, it's contextual and it's dependent on who is using literacy, who is leading this work, and so on and so forth. But unfortunately, inside school spaces, and like I said, I've been an educator for almost 25 years now, and I've been lucky enough, especially within the past several years, to consult all over the country. And inside school spaces, what I'm seeing is that we continue to experience practices and policies that essentially use literacy as a tool for oppression. And this is done through centering of white English-speaking language and literacy practices, through the centering of largely heteronormative texts, and through insistence on one-size-fits-all educational practices and policies, particularly during these waves of back to basics discourse. So the promise of developing not just developing, but developing and sustaining an anti-oppressive praxis is really dependent on our collective willingness to reimagine, first to acknowledge it, that what I have here is happening in many, many, many spaces. We need to acknowledge it, we need to disrupt it, and we need to reimagine what can be in school spaces. And really the best way to do this is to learn from and amplify and integrate the work of folks who have been engaged in this kind of work for decades upon decades upon decades. Many of these folks I've mentioned already here today, but again, many of those folks you can see in the resources that I provided on my handout. And there are far more that I haven't mentioned who are doing this work and who have done this work for forever and forever. The great majority of them being Black women. And so we need to learn from what they have taught us, what they have to say, and really be brave enough, if we haven't already been, to acknowledge and disrupt and work to reimagine how literacy exists in school spaces and outside of school spaces. And I also want to offer some reflective questions to think about. So I often bring these to folks who are interested in engaging in this work deeply. And these are just 4 of many questions that I think we need to ask ourselves. So one is, really thinking about, where does literacy oppression hide in our policies and practices? And I say hide because what I see and what I've experienced and what I've done in my own work is that there are stories that are created through not just what we say and do explicitly, but through implicit things that you see, through just the way policies are enacted, through our environment, through the text we choose to amplify, through how we talk about language and literacy. Some of these are more implicit, but what are those stories that show where literacy oppression is hiding? I think that's a really important question to ask ourselves. Another one is, how are we centering and privileging white Euro-American English-speaking literacy and language practices in our schools and classrooms? Just as one example, and this is not to pick on any one school or place, but because I think this is reflected in many school spaces, there is a school that I've been to several times where they have students who speak over 20 languages, and part of their literacy vision is around really centering or not centering white English-speaking languages, and really honoring the multitude of languages that their students come to their school with. But when you walk around their school, you're really only seeing one language there. And so I really encourage folks to really think about, again, where does that literacy oppression hide? Where does it live in our school spaces? Third one down, how might we decenter these literacy and language practices that we typically center and have historically centered in schools? And how do we offer a wider representation? How do we uplift literacy and language practices that aren't typically centered and privileged in school spaces? And the internal work has to happen too. So how might we interrogate our own experiences or reflect on our own experiences around literacy? And how do they contribute to the assumptions and biases that we hold, that we've been socialized to believe, and thus perpetuate around literacy and language? So I hope these questions are helpful. I know that, of course, we can't question or reflect or even disrupt our way out of oppressive practices without wider systems change. But I do hope that what I've offered here today around just some of the history and some examples at least gives folks some language with which to sort of disrupt and think about this work, and also a few doorways into this crucial work through some of the reflective activities that I'm hoping folks walk away with through these questions. So I do want to thank you all so much again for listening, and for for some of you, if some of that might have felt discomfort, uncomfortable to you, I hope that that you sit with that and think about it. And I thank you in advance for doing that. And I want to also, this QR code, I want to encourage folks to use the QR code or the tiny URL to access some of the work that I cited here today. The tiny URL, it got kind of, when it translated into PowerPoint, it kind of like, didn't populate correctly. So after the tinyurl.com, it should say MR77J6UB. But you should be able to find this on the EdCollab site. And also, again, please make sure that if anything you heard today, beyond what I offered in my closing keynote, if any of that was inspiring to you, if it made you think, if it made you walk away with some ideas, I really, really encourage you to make a donation to our 2 adopted charities, and also, again, thank everybody who made this event possible today, because it has been an incredible experience, and I'm so honored to have been a part of it. So enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you again for having me.
Thank you, Shawna, so much. Really thoughtful, inspiring, like all of your work, just really leading us through ways to think deeply about our own practices, especially if we haven't dug as deep as we should, and to consider how all of our structures and our decisions are really 2 paths. Are they liberatory or not? I especially loved early on when you were pointing out, there's that one slide of, a lot of people talk about literacy in this kind of like civil rights era language, but literacy in and of itself is not automatically freedom. It can be oppression too. And I just appreciate that and everything you shared. Thank you so much for closing our day. And thanks to all of you for tuning in. Just some final announcements and reminders before we go here. If you were inspired by Shawna, which I certainly was, please remember there are lots and lots of ways to get in touch with her. You can find her on our website. You can also find her on shawnacoppola.com, on Twitter at Shawna Coppola, and on Instagram, Shawna_Coppola. Also, a lot of what she talked about here and way, way more is in her brand new book, and pre-orders are available. You can find that link right on her bio and on her bio on our website. Also on the Gathering page, if you're viewing from her closing keynote page, there's a big button for a link for the resources that go along with her QR code. Shawna already did a great job, so I'll just remind you of mentioning our charities. If anything today inspired you, please do go back and take a look at those. Also, just a reminder, if you're watching this as recorded as well too, please do tag the presenters from today, even into the future. It really means a lot to everyone who's given time to share their learning with all of us. So quotes, reflections, or even just a thanks that you want to share, please do tag your presenters. If you tag the Ed Collab as well, at the Ed Collab on social media, we'll be sure to retweet too. I mentioned this morning and just wanted to say one more time that our 2-year cohort of associates, the current cohort is about to end, and our 4th cohort will be starting August 1st of 2023. If you are a literacy educator or literacy adjacent at any level, all of our think tank members cut across many different roles in education. They're classroom teachers, instructional coaches, administrators, college level professors, consultants, librarians, anyone that touches the work that kids do. If you'd like to be a part of a community of educators that always learn online together about once a month, that help to put on free events like this, and that really push each other in these sorts of conversations throughout the year, I've come to find our growing work together as one that both inspires me mentally, but also inspires my heart too. If you'd like to be a part of that, it's a free program. You just have to apply. I'll just warn you in advance, the applications are always stellar. So put some time in, make sure that you're being thoughtful in what you share, but we look forward to reading them. Applications will open on May 1st, and then they'll close on June 1st. And please do share this with anyone else that you think would love this opportunity to have some international community of like-minded educators pushing one another. And a reminder, on Saturday, September 23rd, it's our 20th gathering, and Roald III, we just announced, is our keynote speaker, and we would love to have you as well too. We want to make this the biggest gathering ever. If you've ever presented with us in the past, this is your formal invitation to come back and present again. We would love to also think outside of the box with you on ways that we can have different sorts of sessions than we've had before, in addition to the typical high-powered, really deep dive sessions that we usually do. So those proposals are open right now. You can find them. We just tweeted out the link. You also can find it on our website. So see you on Saturday, September 23rd. Please put that on your calendars. And just to close, thank you for all you do for yourself, for our community, and for your fellow educators. Thank you all, and have a great rest of your weekend, and enjoy. We hope to see you on the tour.